Hey, hello, YouTube. It's going to be a bit of a long one today because I'm doing a reading catch up. A couple videos ago, I announced that I was doing the Read What You Own challenge, and because I'm a really slow reader, I am only going to do 25 books, uh, which I believe was the bronze version of the challenge that was set up by Criminali such a long time ago. And I thought that I would bring you all along for the ride and give you regular updates as to the books I'm reading. Uh, this video series is going to prove two things. Number one, I don't read anything that anybody cares about. And number two, I'm a very slow reader. So, my first book in the series was the Martian Chronicles, which I actually did do a video on. And what was that, like a month ago? And I've only got, hold on, let's look at this stack. I've only got 5 books in here. Hold on, can we do a thumbnail? Yeah, maybe that's the thumbnail. There's only 5 books in here, and this one's really short. This one is also kind of short. This one is not long at all by anybody's metric. This one's actually pretty beefy, fairly beefy for what it is. This one is Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. It's not that long, so I don't want to delay for too long. Let's start it off. First book I read was the Martian Chronicles. I have a whole YouTube video on my page about this book, so I'm not going to talk about it for too long. In fact, I'm barely going to talk about the book at all. My opinion is pretty much unchanged. I don't think there's anything I have to add for my review, although I felt I was maybe a bit negative towards it. I do want to apologize for one thing because in that video, the video begins with my cat. I'm holding the cat up to the camera, and the cat doesn't like it, so I let her go. Her name is Petra, by the way, and I did that because Petra was walking around the floor here, down by my feet, when I was about to record this video. So I just said, well, I want to show her on camera because that'd be nice. I want to show everybody my cat. So I picked her up and I like tried to show her and she ran away. And I kind of felt guilty about that because after I had her in my arms, I was like, well, I might as well put her in the thumbnail so that maybe that'll help people click on the video. And now I just feel like stupid for doing that. Anyway, the Martian Chronicles is okay. And the next book that I read, which took me a while to read, was The Legend of the Holy Grail. Now, you might be wondering, like, exactly what this book is. This book is, it's hard to explain. The Grail is such an old tradition, but this book is a compilation of different original medieval sources of the Grail. This is like the official Grail story, basically, the original one. Most people hear the Grail story as it is told in like Mallory in his book The Death of King Arthur, Le Morte d'Arthur. But there's also the one from the Quest of the Holy Grail, part of the Vulgate cycle. This one is Chrétien de Troyes' original Percival story, which was unfinished, in which the Holy Grail was first mentioned, along with the spear that bleeds, later retconned as the Lance of Longinus, and the Silver Trencher, which was entirely retconned, more or less, although this book does explain what it is. He died before his book was made. He died before he could finish his romance, and in the tradition of medieval troubadours, it was taken upon by other authors to complete his work. So, like, within the next 40 years, 3 other people tried to finish his work, and it ballooned to a massive size. And there's a lot of contradictions, and there's multiple endings to the story, and there's a number of things that are retconned, and it's all spread across all these different manuscripts, and it's kind of a mess. So basically, Nigel Bryant brought together all the sources that he could and tried to piece them together into one coherent narrative, including a ton of material from the High Book of the Grail, which is part of what I want to talk about because it seems to dominate the new material in this book. I have read Chrétien de Troyes' Percival several times. It is a classic. If you're looking at medieval romances, which is kind of chivalric romances, which is a genre unto itself, an extremely niche, deep fried, like nerdy genre that I have done a lot of exploring in, then that is sort of the best you can expect from that genre. And even here, you can see it's like paced really nicely. The character and the psychology of the character is actually, you can interrogate it a bit. Like in all other chivalric romances, every character is as wooden as can be, but you can actually do something with the character of Percival in Chrétien de Troyes' romance. The side quests and the adventures are distinct, unusual, flavorful. The supernatural elements are well crafted. There's a lot of striking imagery. There's a lot of good things to say about Chrétien's Percival. I mean, by the standards of things written in the year 1200, is what I mean. But how were they continued? Well, the High Book of the Grail takes a very weird and interesting turn with it. You can tell by these later continuations that the formula of the chivalric romance, that these people thought that they had perfected it, because the adventures become way out of control. They start sprawling. Like, there's 30 pages, and like every page is a completely new adventure with new characters and new things happening. And then when he's done with that, he walks like 5 feet, and then something else crazy happens. And that adventure relates to something that he did 2 adventures ago. And then 2 adventures later is something that he did 4 adventures ago. And by the end, all of these things which exist, all these crazy supernatural and melodramatic occurrences which occurred apparently within like a 5 mile radius, all come together to form one giant lesson for our main hero. And that's the way, like, what is this book? It's like 270 pages. That's the way, like 250 of these pages are. Well, okay, 200 pages of the story are. Uh, and the pacing is kind of a issue that you run into when you're just like collating random sources like this, because at the beginning there's the backstory of the Grail with Joseph of Arimathea, who, quick lore dump, uh, the Grail is actually uh, the cup Jesus drank from the Last Supper, which Joseph of Arimathea quickly stole and then poured Christ's blood into, and then kept, and then God appeared to him, the Holy Spirit, and he told him that this Grail is important now, and he has to just bring it to the world, and all this backstory. There's like 20 pages at the beginning here that's just a condensation of that romance by Robert de Barone, which I think was adapted in the High Book of the Grail, so that's actually what's in here, excuse me. But that one section is like paced fairly slowly, like takes its time. But then by the time you get to Gawain's like second adventure or something, you're in the High Book of the Grail, and it's like this crazy, sprawling sword fight after sword fight after sword fight epic narrative that I described earlier. And it's, I think in my notes in this book, because I heavily annotated this book, I described it as being almost epileptic in how many incidents there were. That's all right, I don't like to cough during videos. But anyway, what I want to say though is that the thing is, when I talk about these books, I may sound negative, but part of it is that I want to impart what the reading experience of this book is like. And the thing is, if you like Arthurian adventure, this will scratch that itch like nobody's business. It'll scratch that itch until you get bloody scabs on your arm. And you're saying, no more itching. You're going to hit bone in a second. And this book just keeps itching. You will never grow tired with this book. Now, I want to read out a section. That's what these ugly sticky notes on the sides are. I want to read out a section that's just pretty cool, where Percival is fighting a demon serpent that has guarding a blacksmith shop. The blacksmith is the only person that can mend some sword that he's going to bring to the Grail Castle and do all that other shit with. But this part's really cool. So just to like convince you what kind of book this is, I want to read this out to you. Hearing this, all the people present begged him to have mercy, warning him to stay away from there, the blacksmith shop. But Percival would not delay a single moment. He advanced towards the bridge, holding his shield before his face and praying earnestly. He clutched the axe in both hands and stepped onto the bridge to meet the demon beasts. When the serpents saw him coming, they turned wild, rearing up in rage and lashing and clawing at the sandstone slabs of the bridge. Then they surged towards him, blazing in their eagerness. Percival waited until they had reached the full extent of their chains, and then charged at them in a fury, brandishing the great axe, and struck one such a blow that he sent both its feet flying. It recoiled in horror, but the other flung itself at Percival and plunged both its feet into his shield. No weapon, however sharp, could have smashed through with such ease. When Percival, alert as ever, saw that its claws had broken through, he thrust the beast back with the shield and threw the strap off over his head. It was a fine ploy, for hampered by the shield it could not use its legs, and Percival, seeing the serpent's plight, swung his axe and sliced clean through its neck to send the black and hideous head flying into the water. But the first serpent lashed its tail at Percival, and sent him crashing to the ground 2 yards behind. Then it coiled itself into a ball and grasped so firmly with its hind legs' claws that it fixed them in a marble stone. Then out it snaked in a lashing attack. But Percival leaped up with his axe, and with an enormous blow he hacked the serpent's throat and chest, down into its bowels, and from its loathsome body a red smoke belched. Percival took the shield that the serpent had seized and pulled it from its claws. He hung it at his neck by the strap, and stood staring at the marks of the serpent's blow. So, that was cool. Basically, you can see how that sort of reads like a Conan novel, like a Conan the Barbarian novel by Elsbrag de Camp or something. So that's just to show you how exciting this book can be, even though all of its contents are, almost 1,000 years old. But there's something else about the High Book of the Grail that's really weird. It was a strange experience discovering the High Book of the Grail, as it is, the sections that are in here, because it, compared to even other chivalric romances of the time, it is extremely dark and violent and hateful. There's like there's a very radical core to it, a very extremist element that's kind of nasty. And when it's just violence, it's fine. We saw a little bit of violence there where where he's like beheading the demons and slicing through their bellies and stuff. He does that to humans too. But there's parts of this book later that you will see are just strange. Like this one right here. This one's especially hateful towards pagans, which is something that's kind of random and I don't see in many other chivalric romances of this time. When Percival saw they would not address him, he drew aside and summoned them to gather round. Most of them came, but some would not, and the voice cried that he should make them go through the gate where the copper figures stood, for then he would surely see who would believe in God and who would not. This is a city full of pagans that Percival just liberated from some outside threat. Now he's coming back to say God is real, God is true, but does he convert them? No. Violence occurs. Percival drew his sword and rounded them up and drove them before him, and those who would not go could be sure of death. He herded them through the gateway, where the terrible statues were striking their hammers of iron, and of 1,500, only 13 remained who did not have their brains beaten out by the hammers. But those 13 came to believe firmly in our Lord. The evil spirit that dwelt in the copper tower burst out like a thunderbolt, and the tower came crumbling down in ruins. It's kind of nasty stuff. I mean, there's not many books, there's not much literature for the medieval period that I would consider very hateful, but this seems to be one of them. Like, I mean, I said it's very satisfying, it's very enjoyable. Yes, it is, but like there's moments where this kind of sentiment comes through that's very anti-pagan, and this strange, like very unchristian morality it has, where it seems to say violence is the answer. Like it is well known in chivalric code, and it's even explained in Creditor de Troyes Percival that you should not slay a man who begs for mercy. If you unhorse a man in chivalric one-on-one combat, and then they ask for mercy, you have to give it to them. But he denies that rule multiple times with the justification that this man is a pagan. And that's disgusting. There's also another strange thing. Percival marries a lady named Blanchefleur, but he does not consummate the marriage. The reason being that since he's on this Grail quest, he thinks God is talking to him about how he needs to find the Grail before he can consummate his marriage. And maybe there's something in there about how having a child before he's done adventuring is immoral. But it's just very brutish, really. Because listen to this. After Percival has been adventuring for a while after deciding to leave Blanchefleur. He's like on this cliffside totally alone, and somebody appears to him, a lady. "My love, you may go to bed whenever you like and lie with me if you wish. I dearly desire it." This lady is Blanchefleur in all appearances. Percival said he would do just as she wished. The young lady lay down on the rich bed, and Percival lay beside her, and it pleased him greatly, for he had not seen her for a long time. He felt her naked body, a little sensual for something from this period. She wanted him to lie with her and to do all he pleased. She was far from coy or reticent. Then Percival looked up and saw his cruciform sword, with a cross in the hilt. Oh, where was I? And seeing the shape of the cross, he crossed himself, and thus thwarted the demon in the bed. For it was the devil indeed, you may be sure, who in the semblance of Blanchefleur wanted to lure him into sin. When Percival made the sign of the cross by God's miraculous inspiration, the devil leaped up instantly and swept away the pavilion and the bed. Percival was left all alone, shocked and anguished, and he stretched his hands heavenward and cried, "Dear Lord, who became a mortal man, thank you for your protection here. It was the very same devil who tried to drown me." Now, in my notes here, I just wrote what is it? Can you see it? Just a note. They are married, which is so weird. He's being tempted with sex with a woman he married. This is the evil demon who's trying to tempt him into giving in to his evil lusts. And it's in the form of his trad wife that he married. It's a bit strange. But this book was immensely enjoyable. I ought to move on now because I've spent a long time on this. And I do not have as many excerpts in these other books, but there will be some. The next book I read was The Trumpeter of Krakow. Now, this is one Newbery Award book from like 1920, whatever, and it has been forgotten. I guess just like The Dark Frigate by Charles Boardman Hawes, this is sort of a young boy's adventure novel that at one point was considered like the best children's literature of that year, I guess. So I found this random reprint at Vaughn's Books in West Lafayette, and I decided to buy it because it looked nice and it's this nice reprint with this beautiful art. It's got the little Newbery thing there. I had never heard of this book before, and the back of the book made it sound cool. Listen to this. "There is something about the great Tarnov crystal. Wise men speak of it in hushed tones. Others are ready to kill for it. And now a murderous Tartar chief is bent on possessing it. But despite this, Joseph Charnetsky is bound by an ancient oath to protect the jewel at all costs. When Joseph and his family seek refuge in medieval Krakow, they are caught up in the plots and intrigues of alchemists, hypnotists, and a dark messenger of evil. Will Joseph be able to protect the crystal and the city from the plundering Tartars?" I decided to read this book, and I you can kind of see why this was forgotten about. Apparently, this book spawned a legend in Krakow about a mysterious trumpeter. Apparently, in Krakow, the every hour a trumpeter, I don't know if they still do this, but on every hour a trumpeter plays a certain song to indicate that an hour has passed. But this song, for some reason, breaks off several notes before the end of the measure every time. And there's no official explanation, though it is theorized that it used to be a call and response type of jingle where there'd be a trumpeter in one tower begins to play the song and then a trumpeter in another finishes it, but that other trumpeter's got lots of time. This book explains that it's a tradition in honor of a certain boy who, during the Great Fire of 1270, whatever, was standing on top of that very bell tower with that trumpet and went out and sounded the alarm, even though Tartars were down below plundering the city. And as a result, at that very broken note, the note that would be broken, he got an arrow in his heart and died. And now everybody breaks that note off in honor of him. Just kind of a neat story. it gets passed around as fact, but there's no uh, example for it that comes before this book. Some people have theorized that maybe it was an oral tradition until Eric P. Kelly put it down, but I'm gonna call bullshit on that personally because, excuse my language, because Eric P. Kelly was an American. Yeah, this whole book is actually all about Poland. It's got Poland all over it. Poland this, Poland that. Poland, it takes place in Poland, yeah, but it's like, it's very national. In fact, I did not highlight this, but let's like look at the last bit of the book. And now, since we have come to the happy end of all things in this tale, may we close with the thought that every Pole carries in his mind, with the words that are foremost in the Polish national hymn, May God save Poland. And that's the end of the story. But this guy was an American. He wasn't even Polish American. He went to Poland as part of an exchange with the University of Krakow. And he was just really enamored with the culture, which is kind of interesting. But I do kind of wish that this was written by a Pole. Apparently, this book is more popular in Poland than it is here. And I can kind of see, I can obviously see why, because this book is very pro Poland and pro Krakow. The nationalism actually can be kind of a plus and a con with this book because it teaches you a lot about history. You learn a lot about Poland in this book. You learn a lot about Krakow, especially like little details of you meet some of the important people in the city at that time. You get to be introduced to a lot of the buildings, and you're told little facts about like there's the street of the pigeons where every shop has like statues above each one that sort of signify what is in the shop below, and people use those as markers to give each other directions, and that's a plus. And the con is that sometimes it can seem a little bit racist against the Tartars. I mean, they don't seem like good customers, so maybe it's kind of, I don't want to say justified, but maybe it's just inevitable with them being plunderers and whatnot. But I definitely think the racism is also a little bit symptomatic of that nationalism aforementioned. But this story is, well, the prose is a little bit simpler than even the Legend of the Holy Grail, and it suffers a little bit. Let me read you a little section here. My father is Andrew Charnetsky, continued Joseph. He's talking to the little girl of the book that he takes a liking to here and telling her his backstory. And we lived in the country of the Blacklands in the Ukraine. It was lonely in our neighborhood, for the nearest neighbor was 60 staha away. I think that means like miles or something. Yet we never felt fear of Cossack or Tartar, though others did, for my father always treated them well. We were therefore surprised not long ago when there came to us a former servant, a friendly Tartar, who said that we were in some danger, and although my father laughed, I know that he gave the report some credence, since he took the Tartar aside and talked with him privately for a long time. He is not one to reveal his fear, however, and we remained in our house as before, with the warning all but forgotten by my mother and me. Then one night before we went to bed, my mother, who was working upon some sewing, saw a man's face peeping in through the hatch at one corner of our house. It was a face that she had never seen before. It was not one of the servants of our place or any place next to ours. It was a villainous face, and it made such an impression on her that she screamed aloud, alarming us all. Yes, says the girl. The blue eyes were full of interest. That night my father came into the room where I was sleeping, bade me dress quickly, and in a short time led me and my mother through a little door in the rear of the house that I had never seen opened before, since it had always been fastened with nails. Outside this door we found ourselves in a passageway dug out of the earth like a cave, and through this we crept until we emerged into a shed some distance from the other dwellings where two of our best horses were hitched to a cart. That my father had already taken such precautions unknown to us assured me that he had feared something, the nature of which he had kept from us. Now, there's a couple of things you can notice here. The prose is a little bit describey. You know, it feels like the story is being described to you rather than you living it. Even though Joseph is literally describing the story to Elzbieta, the girl, it still isn't told in the best way. And look at this. I'm really pissed off at these two words in particular. That night. I even crossed them out in the book here. Because why would you say that night there? Right? It makes it sound like what you're describing now happened completely separately from the last thing that happened, even though the last thing that happened was this jump scare that should lead to something important like happening as a consequence. It's kind of bad writing. He just shouldn't have said that night. I mean, I feel like anybody could read this book and say that that sort of ruined the flow of that moment. So the writing and the characters are a little bit wooden, but in adventure novels like this, those aren't always important because it's the plot and the situations that matter. And in this story, the great turn-off crystal that was mentioned on the back of the book really is kind of the central heart of this book that really makes it cool. And there's an elder alchemist and a young and precocious, though perhaps misguided student that want to use the crystal's power for questionable means. This crystal is like, it's the size of somebody's head. Excuse me. It's the size of somebody's head. And if you stare into it, then you just start to see things. You start to go places. Questions get answered. It's like the Palantir in the Lord of the Rings. It's basically a Palantir. And I don't want to spoil anything, but there's one particularly cool scene where they're in the attic studying this thing, and it kind of feels like a Lovecraft story because it transports them to this extra dimensional temple where they're looking at scrolls trying to figure out the secret to immortality. And it feels like Lovecraft. I mean, when was this written again? 1920, 1928. 1928. So Lovecraft had yet to write things, I think. I don't think he was writing at that time, but that kind of helps the book. And also some of the situations Joseph gets into are pretty riveting, really. He's stuck in the bell tower. There's like bags are put over people's heads. People are sneaking around. All the things that you kind of want in an adventure book happen here with Joseph as the main character. And of course, in his own little way, he's able to do his own little thing that ends up saving the day and saving Krakow and perhaps all of Poland. That kind of happy go lucky boys' adventure ending that helps empower children by letting them feel like the little role that they have in their life is something important, because in this particular contrived situation presented in the book, them doing their duty even though it's difficult in this particular instance is what ends up saving the day. So that was cool. Although I will say the plot is a little bit weird because it feels like there's no middle. It kind of feels like it's a lot of beginning, and then there's like an action scene that's kind of like the midpoint, and then that immediately goes into like the final climax, starts building up. And it feels like there's no middle to the book, which is a bit of a shame because if there's more development, then I feel like this could have been something more special than it currently is. But as it was an interesting read. Now, speaking of interesting reads, I also read The Last Man by Cousin de Grainville. Or actually, I'm sorry, Jean Baptiste Francois Javier Cousin de Grainville. And this is one of the first novels that people can call proto science fiction. It was published in like what 1805, and this guy commits suicide before the book could be published. And I have read in several places that he commits suicide because the book was received poorly, which doesn't make sense because the book wasn't published yet. There's a bit of a mystery as to why he commits suicide, but it was a shame, not only because his life ended, but also because this book clearly was meant to be put into verse, but right now it's stuck in prose form. Now, in order to provide background for this story, it is an apocalyptic story. It is kind of classed as proto science fiction, but really it's more of like an eschatological fantasy. And I said eschatological, meaning the end of the world, not scatological, as in the study of poop. And it's about how there's the last man who technically if you read most of the book, isn't really a last man because there's just other men around. But he's the last man in the sense that he's the last hope for humanity because all other men and women are suddenly rendered infertile. And this is the last man that was born, which his birth was considered a miracle. And he wants to find the last woman who is still fertile. And how does he get this information? Well, the spirit of the earth appears to him. The spirit of the earth. Now, okay, let me back up for a second. This is sort of a religious apocalypse story. This is sort of written to be a counterpoint to Paradise Lost, whereas that was the genesis of the world. This is the end of the world. And it's not really the end of the world as predicted in Revelations. There's no rapture. That's kind of a modern concept. This is sort of mostly invented, and there's no Lucifer in the story. Actually, there is a mysterious stranger at a number of points, which I think kind of might be Satan, but it is never said specifically. And it takes place in this future world where everything's sort of returning to nature a little bit because there's vast wilderness. Every once in a while, there's a small village with a few people there, and they're all getting kind of senile and old because people aren't reproducing anymore. But luckily, there's our main character who meets up with who gets weird premonitions from the spirit of the earth telling him that there is another fertile woman out there and he needs to go out and reproduce with this woman for the good of humanity, which he does. He hops in a balloon with a couple of other guys and goes across the ocean to America, the continent America, where he finds Brazil, which is a city in this future world. And he meets the woman that can still procreate. But then he starts to see visions from angels and more direct visions from God. And so this other guy who's a scientist says he has a godly vision telling him that he must not do this thing, that he must not procreate with this woman because God told him that humanity's time is now, and him procreating with this woman is him trying to avert the prophecy, which by true prophecy logic means that it will still come true anyway, just in a far worse way. Yes, humanity will persevere, but it will persevere for hundreds of terrible, uh, horrible years. The sun is fading in this book. Earth is starting to grow cold. The heat is being lost, and darkness will soon consume the planet. And if he procreates, he will create a race of people that will have to live in this doomed earth for centuries and centuries to come. They will be slowly debased and benighted until their wretched descendants die and probably go to hell. But the spirit of the earth told him otherwise, because the spirit of the earth is, in this book, the spirit of the earth is a spirit that God entrusted the care of earth to, and he just cares about keeping earth going. Like, even though earth is dying and he's in the core of the earth, like, beating on these big ol' the things that bellows, to keep the earth's fire going from the impending cold. He just wants Earth to keep going, even if it means denying God's will. Is this guy the demiurge? Like, he's basically the demiurge. And except instead of being actually evil like the demiurge is sometimes made out to be, he's more of a morally ambiguous. Uh, and he's just in this book. Like, this is supposed to be a counterpoint to Paradise Lost, and meanwhile, there's a demiurge in it. It's a bit Gnostic. I mean, maybe the demiurge is like a representation of what was evil about man. I'm sorry, that was I don't know if you heard that, but there's like claws on the floor. That was a cat upstairs. Uh, anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the demiurge. Yeah, so he's in this book for some reason, but I think that there are pagan gods in Paradise Lost too, but those were like but those were like demons that people were worshiping as pagan gods, which is like an old thing that people used to believe in Christianity. Nowadays, we're a lot more pluralistic when it comes to religion. But this book is not much of proto science fiction. As I've said, it's more of an eschatological fantasy, but there is science fiction sensibilities here. For example, there is a 20 or so page interlude about the brilliant scientist that once lived named, I don't know, named something. And it's very Stapledonian in that little bit where it narrates how he discovered the flame of life, how he built an island, how he tried to rally humanity, how he made them expand, build seawalls along the coasts and expand the sea, and expand the coastline into the sea by building these seawalls and going into the bottom of the ocean. And it's all very strange stuff. And revitalizing the crops through your new technology. And oh yeah, and then the moon explodes at some point because of a volcanic eruption. That happens. Uh, yeah, it is a very strange book, but it's also very poetic. This book, I was worried that there'd be a lot of like talking, that there'd be a lot of philosophy, that it would not be very fun, but it's very novelistic. There's a lot of incidents in this book, a lot of things happen. And the prose, even though it's fairly simple, not rendered into verse, I mean, it certainly isn't as good as Milton, it's very effective. Here, let me read this part. It takes place kind of near the end. And it takes place kind of near the end. It may be a bit of a spoiler, but A, you're probably not going to read this book. And B, even if you do, this is just sort of something random that happens as a portent of the end of the world. It's not really like plot relevant. But let me read you this. These presages did not deceive. The Almighty had written in the book of destiny that he would preserve the earth for as long as the human race had the power to perpetuate itself. He foresaw that Sideria, that's the last woman, would not survive the flight of Omegarus, and that the only fertile woman left on earth was going to perish. Released from his promises and from the laws he had imposed on himself, God gave the signal for the resurrection of the dead. The heavens responded with sounds of rejoicing. Shudders ran through hell, where the damned sought to hide themselves in the flames. The angels who stood before the throne of God sounded the trumpets of the last day, and the reverberations reached to the ends of the earth. Everywhere, in an instant, the remains of all human beings were revealed. To the north, the ice opened to give them passage, and in the tropics, the boiling seas threw them upon the shores. The graves opened and they came forth, from shattered trees, split rocks, collapsing edifices. The earth resembled an immense volcano from which, through an infinite number of fissures, human bones and ashes were ejected. Oh, it's a longer video than usual, so my voice is dying. When Omegarus saw the opened tombs, the bones issuing from the depths of earth, and human ashes scattered through the air, he was seized with terror. His hair stood on end, and he froze, for he feared to walk upon what seemed to be living dust. The undulating movement of the ground carried him along, as if he were sailing on the sea. Barely able to support himself, he clung to a tree. He clasped it in his arms, resigned to meet his end, like the sailor who, no longer able to fight against the storm, leaves his sails to the fury of the tempest and waits, pale and trembling, for the wave that will sink him or dash him to pieces on the rocks. 3 hours were enough for the resurrection of all human remains, so swift and violent had the eruption been. As soon as God, who knows the number of atoms in the universe, whose eyes can perpetuate the deepest recesses of nature, had seen that earth had yielded up the ashes of mankind, he bade it rest. Then the ocean called back its wild and furious waves. The winds fell away, colliding with one another, and returned growling to their caverns. A mournful silence followed the global storm. Omegarus was astonished to find himself still alive. He dared not believe that peace had returned. He listened. No sound reached his ears. He left the tree he had been clasping and ventured to look about him at the objects surrounding him. He was filled with amazement. The earth was so disfigured that he could scarcely recognize it, as the departing human remains had shattered or destroyed those terrestrial bodies that had housed them. Here, mountains had lost half their foundations and seemed to be suspended in air. There, entire cities had vanished beneath the covering ashes. Everywhere, in all the burial places, frightening gulfs had opened. Not a tree, a plant, a rock, a building remained whole and entire, and all of them appeared in strange and frightening shapes. At the sight of all these broken vessels, Omegarus raised his hands in thankfulness to heaven. It seemed to him a miracle that he was alive in the midst of a wrecked world. With every glance at the ruins surrounding him, he told himself that God had sheltered him under his wings. That thought cleared his mind of the terror that had oppressed him. He began to think that the shock was perhaps no more than the distant prelude to the resurrection of the dead. Already hope had returned to comfort him. He continued on his way and came to the place where once stood the capital of the French Empire. There he thought to find shelter for the night, where he could recover from his painful experiences. How vain his expectations! How time brings changes to human affairs! Paris was no more. The Seine flowed no longer between its banks. The gardens, temples, the Louvre had all disappeared. Out of the large number of buildings that had once adorned her, not even a miserable hut remained where a human being could find rest. The whole place was a wasteland, a vast expanse of dust, home to silence and to death. Omegarus surveyed the sad scene, and seeing the heaps of ashes, was moved to say, "Is this all that remains of the proud city whose slightest movement shook the two worlds? There is not even a ruin, not even a solitary stone on which I could shed my tears. And yet I could fear to see the end of earth, that tomb of mankind and of all human institutions." Yeah, sometimes this book can actually get pretty scary. Near the end, when the earth is dying, it really feels like a very slow decline into death and destruction. And it's actually quite scary. Like that image of all the bones coming up, the ashes covering everything, all of Paris being consumed by the remains of all the humans that have ever died in the history of man. It's kind of terrifying and very poetic, as you could see in that somewhat simple prose. Though this was an outline for a verse story that never came about, this prose edition is actually very readable. It makes you wonder what would have happened if it could have been rendered into prose. Now, I did say that this was more of a fantasy, but there is still a little bit of proto sci fi in here, a little bit of a scientific sensibility, some cosmic significance. I already mentioned the somewhat Stapledonian narrative about the history of mankind and that scientist. But I also want to read this moment here at the beginning of the ninth canto. How diverse and admirable are the works of the Creator! And the earth is not alone in reflecting such variety. Mortals, lift up your eyes and consider the heavens, where a similar profusion is blazoned throughout the firmament. How myriad are the suns that burn in the sky! How endless are the movements that carry them through space! How different they are, despite their infinite numbers, differing in the orbits they describe, in their shape and in their magnificence. Here are planets covered in fruits and flowers that are like delightful gardens, Eden-like worlds where the inhabitants appear like gods of nature, and there ruined worlds roll through the firmament. Sterile wastelands, masses of rocks where venomous reptiles and savage animals fight with one another for their vile prey. More distant still are suns of immense magnitude, flaming furnaces ceaselessly pouring out torrents of light which flood through space. Elsewhere other stars, pale and almost extinguished, emit their last glimmers of light. Thus has God provided infinite variety for mankind. So there you go. It counts as an early work of science fiction. I guess I'd say something like science fiction. The good people at Wesleyan University Press certainly included this in their classics of science fiction line, and I'm very grateful they did, because this book had to be translated out of French, and it has been translated now for the first time since 1805 when it was first published, and it is a good service because this is a very interesting discovery indeed. Now, the last book that I've read. Now, how many books have we read? We've read one, two, three, and four. This is my last book. It's my fifth book. And this one is a library book. So this one does not count towards the 25 book challenge. So that means that I am at 4 right now. Not 5, 4. And this book is Four Winds Farm by Mary Louisa Molesworth, right? Mary Louisa Molesworth. Yeah. And this is 2 books in one, actually. This is Four Winds Farm and The Children of the Castle. Now, if you want a brief introduction to Mary Louisa Molesworth, she wrote books for a juvenile audience, uh, fairy tale books in the Victorian era. Usually fairy tale like. I'd say they're actually very similar to books by Edith Nesbit, though in sensibility they're very much like books by George MacDonald, like the Princess and the Goblin, or some of his fairy tales like, The Lost Princess or The Golden Key or whatnot. They're actually extremely similar. The book that I read today recently was Four Winds Farm, and um, but I had also read The Children of the Castle, so I feel like I've got a pretty good look at Mary Louisa Molesworth and her skill. She apparently wrote a lot of books like this, just like Edith Nesbit did, and I can see very easily that she has a good sensibility for packing a lot into 30, 40,000 words. What any adult would consider a novella, but for a child, I would consider it a novel because enough happens in those 40,000 words. And there's they're all about little children living in Whirl or close to Whirl uh, places where they discover some kind of supernatural entity or being that usually teaches them a moral lesson. In The Children of the Castle, it was a sort of fairy woman with blue eyes and a magical boy, and it would transport them to a different dimension and would teach them these strange it would show them these strange sides to unicorn, a beautiful castle, things like that, but would also teach them to be nice to each other. And it was very sweet and short and felt like the typical children's fairy tale literature that's perhaps a bit saccharine, feels perhaps a bit dated, but is still pretty enjoyable if you like that kind of thing. And the fact that it was written by a woman is a little bit apparent here because in the second book there's a minor villain introduced who's an older cousin that visits them. And the fact that she's a woman is significant because you can tell that it's written from the perspective of a woman. This man here, this boy is written in a way that's very realistic. He's not like an axe murderer or anything like that. That doesn't define his villainy. He's unempathetic. He doesn't listen to people. He's he doesn't care if people are uncomfortable. He shoots people down if they have concerns. That's the kind of villain that he is. And I think it is good to have books where that's the kind of villain, is somebody who's very realistic. Now, of course, the fairy woman finds him and gives him a good talking to, and it's heavily implied that he's going to go down a different path in life because of his meeting with the fairy woman in the attic. Uh, but anyway, Four Winds Farm, which is another similar book of that similar type. I mean, if you like that first book, then you'll like this other book. They seem all the same. But this book is about a little boy who grows up on a farm called Four Winds Farm because that's where all four winds are said to meet. And he's sort of a dreamy child who's often lost in daydreams and doesn't pay a lot of attention to his schoolwork and is often daydreaming. And he realizes one day that he can hear the winds talking, especially in his chimney. Like when the wind scrapes the top of the chimney and the sound rattles down that hole down into the chimney. Chimney havers will understand, but he can hear the wind talking. It turns out each of the four winds is actually a spirit, like a fairy, and each one of them have different personalities. And they're all the bringers of morality to little boys and girls. So throughout the book, he is urged to make moral decisions by each of the four winds who do it each in their own way. I think it's like the east and west winds are nice to him, and the north and south winds are a bit icier and colder because they blow from the polar the polar regions. So there's a scene where he doesn't want to get out of bed and go to school, so one of the polar winds like blows open the window, so he has to get up and shut it. And then he's thinking of going back to bed. So then it blows again even harder this time. It makes him fall over, and it's such a cold wind, and puts on his clothing and decides to start the day. And then there's other parts where he decides to do something nice for somebody. So the nice winds of the east and west, like, sort of blow from behind. He gives him a weird kiss on the cheek, can sort of feel it. Then he can hear a bit of a as it blows past him. So you can see where the fairy tale elements are coming from. There's not a lot to say about this book, although I will say that if you're into George MacDonald or those kinds of retro vibesy fairy tales that are very cozy, this stuff would be good for you. Even Edith Nesbit, I haven't really read Edith Nesbit, but I feel like it's very similar fare. If you're into that sort of Victorian fairy tale fantasy, very cozy vibes, very whirl, a lot of like sitting down next to your fireplace with pancakes kind of stuff, then this would be right for you. And these books are very rare to come by, which is part of why I rented them from the library. So that's why I read it. Okay, I'm done talking about all these books. Let's go through quickly what I read. Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. The Legend of the Holy Grail, translated by Nigel Bryant. The Trumpeter of Krakow by Eric P. Kelly. Krakow. The Last Man by Jean-Baptiste Francois Javier, cousin to Grainville. And Four Winds Farm by Mary Louisa Molesworth. Do you think that's about like 3 weeks worth of reading there? I sure hope so. So don't feel self-conscious if you're a slow reader, because I'm a slow reader with a vengeance. Anyway, I got 4 out of my 25 book challenge. Let's just open my phone real quickly while I'm on camera to see how much that is. 16%. That's about 16% of my challenge done. But I had a great time. I mean, a lot of these books were pretty good. I didn't regret reading any of them. And if I just do more of that while not buying books, then I'll sweep through this challenge easy peasy. I mean, I've felt pretty nice so far. I haven't really had to resist any temptation. I've even gone to a couple of bookstores and places and I've seen things that are interesting, but I haven't felt any temptation whatsoever to buy them because I feel like at this point, not buying feels better than buying just because I have so much to read. I'd rather get to the end of one book and then get to the next thing on my shelf than add more burden. Anyway, that's all that I have to tell you today. I'll see you in the next video next week. Oh lordy, almost gave myself a heart attack or a sore throat doing all that.